In November 1978, a man stepped off a plane in Singapore that would change the course of history for 1.4 billion people. Deng Xiaoping wasn't there to enjoy the sights. He was there to solve a problem. How do you drag a nation out of economic chaos without losing political control? What he saw in those 3 days rewired his entire vision for China's future. Singapore was proof that Chinese people, descendants of the same ancestors, sharing the same cultural DNA, could build a modern, prosperous society. And here's what nobody tells you about this moment. China didn't just admire Singapore from afar. They systematically copied it, sending over 50,000 government officials to study the city-state's every move. But somewhere between the copying and the implementing, something fundamental changed. China took Singapore's playbook and rewrote the ending. The question is, did they improve it or did they miss the point entirely? When Deng arrived, he met Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's founding father who transformed a colonial backwater into an economic powerhouse in just 13 years. Lee famously told Deng that if Singapore's Chinese population, mostly descended from uneducated laborers and merchants, could achieve this level of development, mainland China, with its vast resources and educated population, could do far better. That statement landed like lightning. Deng returned to China and reportedly told his government they needed to learn from Singapore's experience and do it better. Within months, China's reform era had begun. But what exactly was the Singapore model that captivated China's leadership? Three things stood out: a strong centralized state under one-party rule, aggressive economic development strategies focused on attracting foreign investment and technology, and ruthlessly efficient policy implementation. Singapore had proven you didn't need democracy to achieve prosperity. You needed competent technocrats, meritocratic promotion systems, and zero tolerance for corruption. For Chinese leaders emerging from the Cultural Revolution's chaos, this was revelatory. They'd spent decades watching the Soviet model collapse while Western democracies criticized their authoritarian structure. Singapore offered a third way. The copying began in earnest during the 1990s. China established the Mayor's Class training program, where mid-level government officials would spend months in Singapore studying everything from urban planning to media management. Between 1995 and 2016, over 1,350 cadres graduated from just this one program alone. They studied how Singapore designed public housing, managed ethnic diversity, controlled corruption, and maintained one-party dominance while delivering economic results. The Chinese government wasn't subtle about it. They wanted Singapore's outcomes without political liberalization. Here's where it gets interesting. The Chinese officials who went through these programs came back fascinated, but not for the reasons you'd expect. Research tracking these cadres found they weren't impressed by Singapore's authoritarianism or one-party system. What captivated them was practical governance, how Singapore solved concrete problems like traffic congestion, affordable housing, and efficient bureaucracy. They wanted to know how a city-state moved from concept to implementation so fast, how Singapore's government made decisions without drowning in committees and political theater. The ideological alignment everyone assumed drove this relationship? It was secondary. Chinese officials were shopping for solutions, not validating political systems. The results speak for themselves in some ways. China adopted Singapore's model of state-owned enterprises operating with commercial discipline. Singapore's sovereign wealth fund Temasek inspired China's state asset management approach. Singapore's focus on meritocratic civil service influenced China's cadre evaluation systems. The physical transformation of Chinese cities, from Suzhou Industrial Park to Shanghai's Pudong District, borrowed heavily from Singapore's urban planning DNA. You can see Singapore's influence in China's emphasis on greenery, public housing towers, and integrated transport systems. But here's the twist nobody expected. China didn't just scale up Singapore, they fundamentally altered the model's core assumptions. Singapore succeeds partly because it's small, 5.6 million people on 730 square kilometers. Lee Kuan Yew could personally oversee major decisions. Corruption stayed minimal because everyone knew everyone. Singapore's population is educated, cosmopolitan, and plugged into global trade networks. China tried applying these lessons to 1.4 billion people spread across a landmass 13,000 times larger, with hundreds of ethnic groups, vast income inequality, and provincial governments that sometimes act like independent kingdoms. The governance challenges aren't comparable. They're exponentially different. More critically, China took Singapore's authoritarian efficiency, but removed the constraints that made it work. Singapore maintains strict rule of law. Even government officials face consequences for corruption. Press freedom is limited, but not eliminated. Civil society exists within boundaries. There's genuine meritocracy in hiring and promotion. China, particularly under Xi Jinping, has moved in the opposite direction. The anti-corruption campaign targets political enemies as much as actual corruption. Civil society has been crushed. Press control is absolute. Meritocracy increasingly yields to political loyalty. The Chinese Communist Party studied how Singapore's People's Action Party maintained power, but missed that the PAP's legitimacy came from delivering results within a rules-based system, not just from propaganda and control. The divergence became obvious after 2012 when Xi consolidated power. Singapore's model assumes competent technocrats making evidence-based decisions. Xi's China increasingly centralizes authority in one person, weakening the institutional capacity that made reform succeed. Singapore invests heavily in education and talent development because Lee understood a small nation survives through human capital. China's education system emphasizes ideological conformity over critical thinking. Singapore embraced globalization and cosmopolitanism. China under Xi has grown more nationalist and insular. The very things that made Singapore's model work, pragmatism, openness, institutional strength, are eroding in China's version. There's a deeper irony here. China's obsession with Singapore reveals what they actually fear. They want Singapore's prosperity and stability without the political concessions Singapore made. But Singapore's success isn't despite its constraints. It's partially because of them. Limited press freedom still allows criticism that improves policy. Controlled political competition forces the ruling party to perform. Legal constraints on government power reduce arbitrary decision-making. China looked at Singapore and saw proof that authoritarianism works. What they missed is that Singapore's soft authoritarianism succeeds precisely because it's softer than what China practices. The copy diverged from the original at the exact points that matter most. Recent evidence suggests the relationship is changing. Since 2019, enrollment of Chinese officials in Singapore training programs has dropped significantly. Chinese scholars now openly question whether Singapore's model remains relevant as China's economy has grown larger and technologically more advanced than Singapore's. There's growing sentiment that China has moved beyond needing lessons from a city-state. But this misses the point entirely. The valuable lessons from Singapore were never about economic scale or technological sophistication. They were about governance principles, transparency, meritocracy, rule of law, pragmatic problem-solving. Those lessons become more important as countries grow larger and more complex, not less. The fundamental question remains unanswered. Can you copy a model while rejecting its core principles and expect the same results? Singapore works because everything connects. The meritocracy reinforces the technocratic competence, which enables the pragmatic policymaking, which justifies the political control, which maintains stability that attracts investment. Remove pieces of that system and the whole mechanism changes. China tried extracting the authoritarian efficiency while discarding the institutional constraints. They're discovering that doesn't work the same way. Economic growth masks governance problems until it doesn't. Singapore's model was never just about GDP growth. It was about building sustainable institutions that could adapt and self-correct. What makes this story fascinating isn't whether China successfully copied Singapore. It's what their attempt reveals about the limits of political learning between nations. You can't download governance systems like software. Context matters, culture matters, history matters. The constraints that frustrate authoritarian leaders are often the same constraints that make systems resilient and sustainable. China looked at Singapore and saw a shortcut: authoritarian rule delivering prosperity without political liberalization. What they're discovering is there are no shortcuts. Singapore's success came from getting the details right, from institutional discipline, from leaders who prioritize long-term stability over short-term control. You can copy policies, You can replicate programs, you can build identical skylines, but you can't copy wisdom. And that might be the lesson China never learned from Singapore.